Our next speaker is Dr. Nora Volkow, who became the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse in 2003. She's from Mexico City. She went to University of Mexico, and she won the Robin Award for being the best medical student of her generation. No small feat. And in addition, she was named by Time magazine as one of the top 100 people shaping our world. So please welcome Nora Volkow to Aspen, Texas. Aspen, Colorado. I got Austin on the brain.
Good morning. I want to thank Glenn and Joe for inviting me. This is always an extraordinary experience because I do agree there's something very inspiring about seeing everybody here wanting to learn and to use that knowledge in order to do something that can change, that can transform. And as I was listening this morning to these awesome talks, I was actually feeling myself, and you can see the energy coming inside yourself of wanting to do something. And at the essence of that energy, of course, is what enables us to do the things that we do. But interestingly, that capacity to feel and be inspired by what we have heard is at the essence of what drugs disrupt. Now, why do they do it? Why can drugs produce such a destruction on people's life? They can do it because our brains are hardwired to respond to pleasure. Now, this is evolutionary, extraordinary, intelligent design because it's the way that nature ensures that we do things that are important for survival. So we always think about food because if we don't eat, we will die. We think about sex because if we don't have sex, we will not reproduce as a species. But it's much more than that. It's that excitement and motivation that make us wake up every morning with the energy and says, I want to do that. It's our ability to create partnerships, to get excited by seeing others. That's at the essence of the reward circuitry. And that's actually what drugs, by pure randomness of nature, chemicals can directly stimulate those systems. And in people that are genetically vulnerable, that can create havoc by producing addiction. Now, what is the impact of substances, of drugs of abuse in our country? It is gigantic. Out of the drugs, nicotine and illicit substances, it is estimated that close to $500 billion are lost in our country every single year. Now, what about deaths? Deaths are gigantic. Just let's look at nicotine, tobacco. 400,000 people die every year in the United States from tobacco-related illnesses. This needs not be. Substance use disorders are preventable. Alcohol kills an innumerable number of people, 120,000. It's the number one cause of morbidity that is in young people that are not supposed to die out of alcohol and the accidents associated with it. So the problem is gigantic. Now, what are we doing as a society? We're turning our shoulders back and ignoring it. What is the healthcare system doing about it? Saying, no, it's not our responsibility. People are taking the drug because they want to get high, because they want to have pleasure. It is their fault. Let's put them in prison so that they don't do that again. And yet, just imagine a pleasure that is so extraordinary that you would be willing to give everything you care for, your family, your work, your money, everything, just for that fleeting pleasure given by the drug. Imagine. It doesn't make sense. And it's even more puzzling than that, because if you ask a person that's addicted, why do you take the drug? They'll say, Doc, I don't even know. That drug is no longer even pleasurable. I just cannot control it. And in that statement, I just cannot control it, lies the essence of the process of drug addiction. That state in your brain where you lost the capacity to stop a behavior, even though you consciously don't want to do it anymore. Imagine that. Imagine that you don't want to do something and yet you cannot stop. That's it at the erosion of what actually enables us to exert free will. And that's what drug addiction is about. And I've been shocked by that state that can actually remove, that can literally make us slaves. The drug can make us slaves so that our brain does just want to take the drug. And that's what I've devoted all my life, to try to understand it. Because by understanding it, then we can start to, of course, try to do interventions to prevent these diseases that should not be there, and to also learn more about what makes us uniquely human. What is it that allows us to exert free will? At the basis of our understanding now about why drugs can produce addiction is because they stimulate the dopaminergic pathways in our brain. And these dopaminergic pathways in our brain are evolutionary, very, very ancient. You can see it in organisms that are very, very primitive. They are there because they are actually associated a behavior with a reward. And that's the way, as I told you, that nature ensures that we do things that are important for survival. So if food were not pleasurable, if there was not a rewarding effect for it, you would not go through the behaviors necessary to consume it. Now, drugs activate that system directly. They stimulate it, and that in turn, in our brain, is associated with a reward, which you immediately learn, and therefore it will motivate you next time to want to take it again. But there's no evolutionary advantage. So how do we now look at the human brain and try to understand how drugs in the human brain activate these dopamine systems? Where we use brain imaging technologies, this is positron emission tomography, that allows us to actually identify the changes in dopamine, the stimulation of the dopaminergic system by drugs of abuse in the human brain. Very powerful tool, because then you can actually investigate whether indeed the person that's taking the drugs, that is addicted, is taking them because they are incredibly rewarding. This is a normal person, and you study them under two conditions. In any experiment, you give a placebo, and then in another day, you give them a drug, in this case, intravenous methylphenidate, which cocaine abusers report to be very similar to intravenous cocaine. You measure the receptors that are not occupied by dopamine, and when you give a placebo and you get an image like this one, seeing the red, where is the radioactivity binds to those receptors. You give your drug, in this case, the drug increases dopamine, which is what all of the drugs of abuse do. All of the drugs that produce addiction increase dopamine. Dopamine occupies these receptors, and then you give your radiotracer, and it can no longer bind because these receptors are occupied by dopamine. And then you can actually, based on comparing the difference between these and these, you can mathematically estimate the relative changes in dopamine produced by a drug. And so you can take different individuals, which is what you have here, people, and you measure the changes in dopamine produced by, this case, intravenous methylphenidate. You see tremendous variability. Some of them have very large changes. Some of them have no changes at all. And in parallel, you can measure the self-reports of reward that the person is experiencing when they get these drugs. And you can see that indeed, the greater the increases in dopamine, the more intense the rewarding effects. So this is a tool that now, in the human brain, allows us to ask that question. Is it really as simple as that, as we have actually traditionally explained the behavior of people addicted, that they actually have in them an enhanced sensitivity to the rewarding effects of the drug? And believe me, for this has been the traditional clinical explanation that we give in medical school and in psychiatry to understand this behavior. So we've been doing these studies, and what the data has shown you is exactly the opposite. This is a control subjects, average different control subjects, 17. You see the images where the binding of the ligand, because the receptors are in a placebo. You give them the drug, dopamine goes up, it occupies the receptor, the radioactive compound can no longer bind, and you can see the difference. Let's look at the cocaine abusers. Visually, you don't see anything. In these individuals, the effects of the drug to increase dopamine is profoundly attenuated. And if you quantify, this is the changes in controls, this is the changes in abusers. These, in the cocaine abusers, cannot even be differentiated from a placebo, indicated that they are profoundly attenuated. Drug-addicted people are not taking that drug because they actually have an enhanced response. This is another study that we did recently, also dramatically showing this difference. These are different planes of the brain in which you are actually identifying colors, the areas where the drug has increased dopamine. And in a normal individuals, you see it exactly in the areas of the brain where you have the main reward circuitry, as well as some of the cortical areas of the brain that link with these limbic areas. These are cocaine abusers, no response, and actually our threshold is much lower because otherwise you don't even see these very tiny signals. And these responses are horrifically attenuated, whether you expose them just in a laboratory setup or when you expose them with videos that mimic the administration of cocaine to try to emulate the natural experience, indicating that indeed in the addicted individuals, and this has been replicated, I'm illustrating it with cocaine, but similar identical findings have been demonstrated for alcoholism, a profound attenuation on the ability of the drug to actually increase dopamine when it is consumed. Now, when we started to get this data, my brain was hurting me. And it was hurting me because it just didn't make sense. Both the laboratory experiments and the clinical data had clearly shown that the ability of drugs of abuse to increase dopamine in the reward centers of the brain is crucial to exert their rewarding effects and therefore to motivate the behavior to consume them. And it hurt me because then it didn't make sense. If they are not increasing dopamine when they're getting the drug, why would they even bother? And this lies actually an aspect that gives you, leaves you in awe about biology and evolution. What the dopamine system does is actually fascinating. We thought it was just reward. So when something is rewarding, dopamine goes up, and that's wonderful. And indeed, if you get a reward that you had never experienced in your life, and it's fantastic, dopamine goes up. But what dopamine does in that brain of yours that is naive is immediately link it into the memory processes in an unconscious way that will link that experience with a pleasure. You're not aware of it. Your brain is. This is what Pavlov discovered many, many years ago when the dogs will salivate when they hear the sound. That sound is the association, that learned response. They know, they predict unconsciously that there will be a pleasurable response. And that is at the essence of a lot of the things that we do. When we're speaking about memory, we think about memory of the past, but one of the most important functions of our gigantic brains as humans, as well as other creatures, I shouldn't be in any way prejudiced, is to predict the future. Now, how do you predict the future? You predict it based on your learning experiences. So one of the most important things that you need to predict is stimuli that are rewarding. Why? Because food is rewarding, and you want to be able to immediately link a food in, when food was not available, of course not now when there are 7-Elevens and refrigerators, to motivate you to do the behaviors to get it. That conditioning, that we call conditioning, is fundamental for us to do a lot of things. And guess what? Drugs hijack it. Why do they hijack it? Because they are very potent rewards. And in animal experiments, for example, in rats, you can take little rats and you can expose them just like Pavlov did. Instead of food, you give them cocaine, and instead of the sound and looking at salivation, you look inside the brain at dopamine in the reward centers of the brain. Expose them repeatedly to the sound, one group, the green little animals, and the purple little animals, the sound and the cocaine, sound, cocaine. Bring them to the lab, expose them not just to the sound, and measure dopamine. The animals that have only seen the sound, there's no dopamine, it's a neutral stimuli. The animals that have been associating that sound with the cocaine, when they expose them to the sound, only the sound, dopamine goes up as if they had gotten cocaine. There's no cocaine in their brains. They have been conditioned, and the cue, the sound, triggers the response. And what's fascinating, and it makes, of course, tremendous, the evolutionary sense to have it this way, and I'll tell you why. The magnitude of this increase predicts how much the animal is willing to work in order to take the cocaine, which we measure by having the animal press levers. The greater the increases, the more they press the lever. Now, why this is evolutionary advantageous? Imagine that that food is scarce to get, not now. So you are in the jungle and you see a banana, and just by pure chance it was there in the floor, you taste it, it's sweet, it's delicious, dopamine goes up, you get conditioned. Next morning, you're walking through the forest, you're hungry, you see a yellow thing up there in the tree, and you want to jump it. Because you want that drive to jump it comes from the fact that the cue is stimulating dopamine, and that leads you to climb the tree and eat it. If the dopamine went up when you are eating the banana, it defeats the purpose. What nature wants to do is motivate you to do the behaviors to get that banana. And that's what drugs do in your brain. They condition you such that you have this enhanced motivation to want to take them, even though they are no longer pleasurable for many of these individuals. And indeed, using imaging studies, we have shown that in cocaine abusers, those that really do not anymore decrease their binding when you give them drugs, stimulant drugs, you can decrease it just by showing them videos of people consuming cocaine. And the magnitude of those increases, the magnitude to which this video observing this cue is able to increase dopamine is associated with their subjective perception to want to take the drug. And this is why drug addiction is so difficult to treat. And this explains why a person may have been able to stay clean for very long periods of time. They get exposed to a cue and they immediately relapse. This is not a behavior they are controlling is an automatic response, just like the dog salivate, or we can also salivate if we think of something very delicious. But the story in drug addiction is actually even more complex than this. Because when you are taking these drugs that supraphysiologically stimulate these dopaminergic reward pathways, dopamine also controls not just reward, but the areas on the brain, the prefrontal cortex, that enable us to exert self-control, to regulate our emotions, to regulate our desires. These ones here. Dopamine is indispensable for the proper function of those areas of the brain. And one of the most interesting areas along in research has been that one of the receptors that modulates those responses, the dopamine D2 receptor, regardless of whether you are a cocaine addict, a methamphetamine addict, an alcohol addict, a heroin addict, there is the repeated administration of the drugs is associated with a reduction of these dopamine receptors that modulate, among other, the areas of the brain that enable you to exert self-control. And indeed, in human subjects, you can actually investigate whether you're a cocaine abuser, a methamphetamine abuser, or an alcoholic, where you see these decreases in dopamine D2 receptors, that they are indeed, these decreases are affecting the function of the human brain. These decreases in the central parts of the brain regulate the signaling to the prefrontal cortex, enabling it to actually inhibit prepotent or inhibit automatic responses. And we and others have now shown that the lower the levels of these dopamine D2 receptors, the lower the activity of these areas in the prefrontal cortex that allow us to exert self-control. And in my brain, studying the complexity of the human brain and the complexity of human behaviors, it leaves me also in awe that one single protein, one receptor, can have such a profound effect on the function of the areas that enable us to exert self-control. And in animal models, we can manipulate it. We can increase those D2 receptors. And if anyone asks me, what is it that you would like to do to treat drug addiction? If you had only one thing, what would you do based on your knowledge? I would say something that allows us to increase the levels of dopamine D2 receptors in our brains. In animals, we can do it. We can do it genetically. And when we inject the genes, we can do, D2 receptors go down, and then whether it's alcohol drinking or cocaine intake dramatically reduces, indicating that this is like a switch that enables us to exert control. The erosion, that decline in the expression of these proteins, facilitates impulsive behaviors, facilitates compulsive behaviors. So how do you take this information and put it into a model that help us treat better substance use disorders, but also help understand better our everyday actions? You have the brain of a person that's addicted has been modified by their chronic exposure to the drug as well as by genetic vulnerability. And when you compare it with that of a non-addicted brain, you see very striking differences. In the brain of someone that's not addicted, the prefrontal cortical areas of the brain are always assessing and making decisions and determining whether a behavior we should give in into the temptation or resist it. The desire to take it comes from limbic brain areas that include the conditioned responses that will activate reward systems and motivational systems. And the balance between the intensity of the desire and our ability to exert control determines whether we will stop or not. If your prefrontal cortex is working properly, you can make a decision to stop and you stop. But if you are a person addicted to drugs, the control systems are markedly eroded because the D2 receptors stimulation has damaged the function of the prefrontal cortex. The memory condition systems are enhanced such that when you get exposed to the particular drug, you actually have a very strong response from the conditioning. It becomes highly motivating and salient. The prefrontal cortex, and I don't have to explain how that happens, gets totally disconnected. And the prefrontal cortex, being the brakes of your brain, no longer function, and you go. You take the drug, this is conditioning you again. Again, you want it, it's enhancing the dopaminergic signaling through the conditioning pathway. This is not working, you take it again, and again, and again, in a compulsive pattern that in many instances cannot be terminated until the patient physically collapses. So how do we take this information into treatment? Recognizing that what type of interventions we can do, for example, to increase our ability to exert self-control. And you just heard the presentation of how meditation can help patients with post-traumatic stress disorder. Now there is significant evidence that meditation can help us in exerting self-control. We can use biofeedback technologies that enable us, by looking at our images as they are working, as our brains, as they are working in real time, to learn how to inhibit our amygdala so that we can control our emotions better, and that way may be better able to stop this intense drive and motivation to take the drug. And finally, I always like to say there is the now way that we can solve problems. And then there is the way that technology can get us into the future, where we can transform the way that we do things. And one of those transformations is, again, science and technology. And the limit is really our imagination and our motivation and will to do it. One of the most exciting areas that we currently have, for example, is the development of vaccines. Vaccines that will interfere with the entry of drugs such as nicotine, methamphetamine, and heroin into the human brain. There are challenges, but imagine if we do succeed, that would provide us not just a completely different therapeutic intervention, but we could have in our hands a tool that could potentially prevent substance use disorders. Thanks very much.
I always hate to cut off the brilliant speakers. No, that's okay. It's all right. Okay. Let me just mention, thank you so much, Nora, for that terrific talk. If you haven't seen Charlie Rowe's series that he did on the brain with some of the top neuroscientists and people studying the brain in the world, it's really worth watching, and Nora was on one of those segments with Charlie Rose. We're going to take one quick question. We're running a little bit behind, and hang on for a moment for the microphone. All the way over here in the corner by the camera.
Thank you so much. Could you speak a little bit about immunotherapy, amino acid supplements relative to addictions?
Yeah, we have funded researchers. Researchers have looked at it, and the idea is there are two major ideas. One of them, can you take amino acids that can increase the synthesis of dopamine in the brain, because that's one of the areas that's a deficit. And the other one is, can you take any amino acids that can improve the function of the serotonergic neurotransmitter system that is very important for mood, and mood also plays an important role in your vulnerability for substance use disorders. Unfortunately, as of now, none of those studies have provided with positive results.
Thank you. Thank you.